Welcome back to Studying Psalms Today. Today we're going to be looking at Psalm 55. 55 is a psalm of betrayal. Again, this is the second of the Maskell Psalms we've had on betrayal, but this betrayal is a little bit different. This betrayal is by a close friend, not just a family member. And this close friend, when you look at and examine it, is probably Joab. Now, Joab is one of those really interesting characters out of the Bible. One of the things that we learn about the truism of the Bible is that not all characters are black or white or good or bad. There's some of them that you just have trouble figuring out what they are, and Joab's one of them. Joab has a lot of good qualities, but then he has some which are pretty bad as well. Now, let's look at the person of Joab and see who he is and what his history is. Joab is a nephew of David. David's sister had three sons, Joab, and he had two brothers. And so Joab probably joined David early in his exile when he began to collect the 300 men that would stay with him. He was probably among that number. Now, we don't know that. We're not told of that because we see him first appearing whenever the mighty men are taking over that area known as Jerusalem before it became Jerusalem. So David quickly elevated Joab, and Joab became the leader of his forces and the leader of his army. Now, David, among his fighting men, had 30 of his men that were exceptional. And Joab was the leader of those 30. When we look at Joab's history, we see someone who is very, very loyal to David. And he's in a very trusted spot. But he's also self-serving. After the battle that killed King Saul, we see Joab, and he is coming to this place where he is second in command of David's army. David is at Hebron. And David is trying to reunite the country after Saul's death. And so David has this meeting with the captain of Saul's army, which is Abner. And they reach a truce. And so they have reached a peace. And after Abner left David's presence and was headed out of the city, Joab called him over close. While they were talking, Joab put his arm around Abner and then took out his dagger and he stabbed him in the abdomen. And it held him close enough to where the blood of Abner got on Joab's belt and soaked his shoes. So again, this term he came up with, David said he had blood on his belt. That's a term of being pretty treacherous, that you hold your enemy close enough and you stab them where their blood gets on your clothes. This made David very angry, and David placed a curse on Joab. But he left him in his place of power, and Joab stayed there as the leader of his army through the death of Abner and continued on in that position. Now, another one of those stories involving Abner is that when David's son Absalom had killed one of his half-brothers and was exiled, Joab was very instrumental in getting Absalom to come back to the kingdom. It was Joab that persuaded David to accept him back, which began David's undoing. It was Joab that also killed Absalom directly against David's orders, but he did it to preserve the kingdom because he knew that if Absalom lived, he would not change his ways. And so he killed Absalom because he was a threat to the kingship of David. So we have all these stories that are mounting up against Joab. And Joab, he is always in a very trusted position. Another example is when David arranged for Bathsheba's husband to be killed, the person he went to was Joab. And Joab, leading the army, was the one that gave the command to withdraw from Uriah. So Joab, once again, he knew of David's scheme, and he carried it out. Once Joab had killed Absalom, the captain of Absalom's army was named Amasa. And Amasa, who was also kin to David, was then, in order to reunite the country, because you had half the country that was following Absalom and half of them that was following David, in order to reunite the country, David appointed Amasa head of the army in Joab's place. Joab didn't like this. And in their first battle, Joab, in the same manner that he killed Abner, pulled Amasa close and stabbed him and left him to die beside the road. And so, again, he had blood on his belt. So Joab, you can't ever figure out whether he's a good guy or a bad guy, because he does things which are so loyal to David. But on the other hand, he goes against David's orders, and lots of times he's being self-serving to keep his position. The last thing that Joab did, which was kind of like the straw that broke the camel's back, is when David was old and he was selecting a new king, David selected Solomon to be the next heir. Joab thought one of David's other sons, Adonijah, would be a better king. And so he planned where Adonijah would take over the kingship in place of Solomon. And so David had to hurry up and hold a coronation for his son Solomon, for Solomon to become king. And then on his deathbed, he told Solomon not to let Joab go unpunished. He didn't sign Joab's death warrant, but Solomon was the one that had Joab killed. And the reason that he had him killed was for what he had done against David, and that was David's wishes. So Solomon was carrying out David's wishes. So here we have this psalm where David talks about being betrayed by someone who was a very close friend. This fits Joab. It says it was a very close friend that they used to go and do things together. And he also talks about other phrases such as, his words are smooth as butter. This also describes Joab. So we have this picture of Joab in his betrayal of David. And David, all this time, has been forgiving Joab. And even up to the point of David's death, he has forgiven Joab. However, forgiveness and justice are two different things. He could forgive what he did against him personally, but he still had to seek justice. So lots of times that's the way we are today. We may commit sins. God may forgive us. However, we still have to have and serve justice. For instance, you rob a bank. God can forgive you of robbing the bank, but you still go to jail. So with forgiveness, we see there's different areas of forgiveness and how we can be forgiven. One, we can be forgiven by the personal offense of the personal damage that was done to somebody. Two, you can be forgiven of the consequence. All right? Go back to the example of robbing the bank. You can be forgiven by the banker, and you can be forgiven by the legal system, and you don't go to jail. All right? The third area is that sin against God. And that's the most important to us as Christians, is because that sin against God is what we can be forgiven of, but also we want to be careful that we don't do things just because we're forgiven. We want to be sure that we don't abuse that grace that's given us. We don't abuse that forgiveness. So let's talk about the other thing that's involved in this, and that's the hypocrisy. Hypocrisy, if you go back to the root word, it comes from the Latin word which means to act. You'll see the mask with the happy and the sad faces. Those were from Greek drama, and they talked about the mask that actors would hold in front of their face. If they were saying a line, if they were in sorrow, they would have that sad mask up in front of them. If they were joking and lively, they'd have the happy mask up. So this hypocrite talks about holding a mask up in front of your face. We do that all the time. In fact, sometimes we even put that mask up with God. And that's what we need to be especially aware of, because sometimes God, He already knows what's behind the mask, but we want to seem good in front of God. We want to put on a front. We're inside that we are actually struggling with something, or we just don't feel it. So in this case, we see Joab, and we can't tell what's behind the mask. God could, but we couldn't tell what's behind his mask of why he does what he does. Was it out of loyalty to the kingdom and to Jesus, or was it out of selfish ambition? We can't tell. What he was saying, what he was doing was two different things. As Christians, when we look in the mirror, what do we see? Because that is the ultimate guide, the ultimate way to look at hypocrisy. When we look in the mirror, what do we see? Do we see Christ, or do we see ourselves? Do we see selfish ambition, or do we see godly ambition? Most of us, I bet, do both, depending on the time and the place. But I just want to throw out one thought before we move on. If you are a covert Christian, which means that you are Christian, but you hide what you do, that is a paradox, because as Christianity, we can't hide that light under a bushel. We can't hide it. We're not supposed to hide it. God doesn't want us to hide it, because if we confess his name before men, then he'll confess our name before the Father. Jesus told a story. Many of us would call it the parable of the Good Samaritan, or the story of the Good Samaritan. And there are certain things which are different about this than the other parables that Jesus would tell. Because often when Jesus told a parable, he would leave out specifics. He would leave out names, places, anything that would be specific so that it could be universally applied. But now in this particular parable, he didn't. He named the Samaritan, and he also named Jericho. And so these would turn out to be very significant in their meaning, because any Jewish scholar would know from Jewish history. In 2 Chronicles 28, the story is told of this time when Israel and Judah were at war with each other. And the two nations weren't always peaceful. Israel, when the nation divided, it had just one evil king after another, just one after another. It never had a good king. And with Judah, they'd have evil kings and they'd have a good one. And then they'd have more evil ones and they'd have another good one. And so they wavered back and forth. This was a time when Israel and Judah were at war with each other, and Israel had several nations that were on their side. And they attacked Judah, and they won. And Judah, a lot of the men were injured or killed, but they were taken captive. And so the other nations that were involved with Israel said, we're going to give the captives to you. And so Israel had all these captives from Judah. Now, they could have enslaved them, but the prophets of the time went to the leaders of the nation and said, okay, the reason Judah lost the battle is because God was punishing them. And you, Israel, have been in that same situation where God has punished you. So don't take them captive because they're being punished for the very same things that you have done. So what did they do? They took the men from Jerusalem that were injured. They clothed them. They put oil on their wounds. They put them on donkeys and took them to Jericho. Now, if that doesn't sound familiar, that's the same thing that the Samaritan did with the person from the parable of the Good Samaritan. He put him on a donkey, he clothed him, put oil on his wounds, and took him to an inn in Jericho. When Jesus was telling this story, the scholars that would know of that time, and that should have been a point where some of revelation. However, they were not open to God's word. That story has a lot to do with the people that Jesus is talking to with their hypocrisy. The point of the Good Samaritan is that he realized his own personal state, that he was always in this constant state of living and asking for the forgiveness of God. And by doing that, he took care of the person who was beat along the roadside. How do we bring our forgiveness before God? Because there's a particular phrase that comes from the Psalm that both David uses and the Apostle Peter uses in the New Testament. And that's to cast your cares, cast your burdens upon him. In order to be at that place of forgiveness, to be able to forgive that other person, whether it's a nation you were at war with, or if it is your brother or your close friend who has betrayed you, there are certain elements that you'll need. One, you have to decide that being at peace with God is more important than whatever you've suffered. It's more important to be at peace with God than it is to get revenge or justice, or however you want to state it. The most important thing is to be at peace with God. Two, you have to de-sin yourself. Now, let me explain what de-sinning yourself is. You have to look at the situation in any or all of that situation that is your responsibility, that you were responsible for, that you have to ask God for forgiveness for that portion of it. Not the whole thing, but the portion that you're in control of, that is yours. You have to de-sin or ask for forgiveness from God for it. This de-sinning or asking for forgiveness for your part is like the Hatat sacrifice. The Hatat sacrifice is basically one that is for something that you have done wrong. The other is that you have to accept that Christ was the sacrifice for your wrongdoings and for their wrongdoings, for all wrongdoings that are come to him. That is the Olah sacrifice. And often these two sacrifices were combined. If someone went to the temple and they couldn't afford a calf to be sacrificed, they would sacrifice a lamb. If they couldn't afford a lamb, they were ordered or told that they had to sacrifice 2 doves. 1 dove for the Hatat one for the Olah. Now, this procedure was whenever they got to the Olah, the person who was giving the sacrifice had to put their hand on the head of the animal to be sacrificed. This was to signify that they understood that this animal was taking their place. When we look at Christianity, that's the very thing that Christ did for us. He took our place. He was our ultimate Olah sacrifice. Now, once the dove had been sacrificed, the parts of the dove which were not sacrificed, they were to be taken and cast on the ash heap of the altar. We also have to do that. All of that unfinished business when we forgive, all that residual animosity, that has to be cast on the ash heap of God's altar. And we have to turn it over to God. And we let God deal with it. But we don't. The last thing that you have to do is that you have to leave it there in God's hands and don't take it back. And if you have to take it back, you repeat all the steps again. And you do it as often as you need to until you can resolve whatever hurt that is that this person has done to you. So that brings us to the conclusion of Psalm 55 and the story of Joab. I hope you have found this beneficial, especially when it comes to forgiveness. And until next time, keep a psalm in your heart. And next time, we'll be studying Psalm 45. It's about spiritual relationships. I hope you've enjoyed the video so far, but I want to encourage you to also get the book, Lyrics by Adonai. Not only does it allow a more in-depth study of the Psalms, but it's filled with questions and meditations, and it's a great study guide for either personal study or a group Bible study. And remember, just as stone sharpens stone, share it with a friend and then talk about it after.